So today's presentation is titled Birds, Friends or Foes, and will be presented by Breanna Martinico. Breanna is a human wildlife interactions advisor with UC Cooperative Extension. Her background is in wildlife biology and ecology, and she specializes in ornithology. Breanna is currently working to develop a research and extension program that increases knowledge and adoption of management practices that reduce pest problems and promotes ecological sustainability. So thank you, Breanna, for joining us today. You can go ahead and share your slides.
Sure, just give me a second to share my screen.
Yep.
All right, are you seeing that okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited to be joining to talk about birds today. And I'm going to be talking about, some instances where birds are beneficial and some instances where they cause us problems and we want to take management actions. And, how can we balance that act with being sustainable, using IPM practices, and supporting, wildlife. And I want to start out with just talking about the positive and negative interactions that we have with birds and kind of how we categorize them. So I work a lot in agricultural ecosystems. So my first two examples are from agriculture, but they are relevant in almost any landscape, especially urban, suburban, and even within our any of our human dimensions. So when we do have positive interactions with birds, we call those ecosystem services. So birds provide us with pest control and pollination, and just the intrinsic value of having birds around is positive. And we can classify the negative interactions with birds as ecosystem disservices. So in agriculture, a really big ecosystem disservice from birds is foraging on crops. And how we interact with birds is really going to depend on the scale. So for example, on the local scale, so this is a farm field, but this could be, your neighborhood or your property at your house, your front yard or your backyard. So what's going on in the immediate surrounding area? So on a farm, it's what crop is being planted, what plants are nearby. And on the landscape scale, so zooming out and taking a snapshot of where are you situated in the world? Do you live on the coast? Is it in the mountains? Is it in the middle of an intensive agricultural area of the Central Valley? Because that's going to provide the background kind of community of what birds are already there and how they kind of functioning in that ecosystem. But I do want to point out that a lot of the services that birds do provide to us, they are essential for ecosystems to remain sustainable and, preservation into the long term. But I will acknowledge that, foraging, nesting, and roosting birds in the proximity of humans is, it can cause damage to property and pose health and safety risks as well. So we kind of want to think about, balancing the good and the bad. And so I hope by the end you can see that maybe birds are friends and foes in certain situations. And then to make it even more complicated, seasonality is also a really big factor in determining whether a bird is a pest. So my second agricultural example is in sunflowers, where blackbirds in spring, well, many birds in spring eat insects to feed their young, protein-rich diets. And then because blackbirds, for example, are omnivorous, they do switch to eating grains and seeds. So those sunflower seeds that are being grown become very, very delicious meals for these guys. And they can switch from being beneficial to being a pest based on what season it is. And in the fall, these blackbirds can make these huge flocks, and that doesn't really happen as much in the spring because they're more dispersed. They're secretive because they don't want any predators to find their nests. But just kind of an example to show that just because one bird might be a pest part of the year, it could be beneficial in another part of the year. So it's seasonal. To give you a brief talk outline, I'm going to first talk about some integrated pest management for birds, so going over identification, regulations, and management. And then the second half of the talk will be focused on how can we promote beneficial birds in our spheres, so landscaping for birds, songbird nest boxes, and also predatory birds. Let's see. All right, so we heard a little bit from Lauren about the concept of integrated pest management, and some of the main points were that it's science-based decision-making process. It combines tools and strategies to identify and manage pest problems, and also minimizes risk to people and the environment. So how can we apply that to managing birds? Well, the first step on our IPM wheel here is pest ID. And so identification is incredibly important for managing any pest species, because you need to know what you're dealing with, and what rules and regulations may apply to that, and what strategies are effective for those species. But for birds, identification can be very, very, very challenging. Just look at this picture over here and try to take a guess at how many different bird species are present in these 4 pictures. So there are actually 2 different species here, even though all 4 birds look slightly different. We have the house finch over here, the female and the male house finch. They're native songbird species. And then we have our house sparrow, or our English sparrow, on the right. So they're a non-native songbird species. So males and females can look different in a single species. And then sometimes you get these more drab brown looking birds that don't have very good field marks, especially if you're seeing them moving by really quickly or in a bush. You're not going to necessarily be able to differentiate between them very easily. So it can be very, very challenging. But this is where I would like to also challenge you, because bird identification can also be very, very fun. Just even sitting in your backyard with your coffee and your binoculars and a bird ID guide, getting to know what birds are using your backyard, it's can be a really great way to relax and connect with nature, and you might be surprised at what you find if you look that you weren't noticing before. So the next step for our IPM strategy is prevention. And this is next because the preventative measures can be much more effective than control, because if you can prevent something from happening, then you're going to have a better outcome, and you're not going to have to mitigate or repair damage or anything like that. Oops. So monitoring, and this is where if you are good at watching birds, you'll have a better idea of how to monitor them, when to monitor them, but paying close attention to what's going on will allow you to address problems before they become too large. Oh yeah, this is where I was going to say, this is where your bird ID skills and just practicing watching birds can help you. Next is, what are the options? Like, what can you do? And so this is where you might need to consult with a professional, talk to your UC extension advisors, stay informed on what the effective management strategies, what's legally allowed and appropriate. So birds are actually governed by a variety of laws and regulations, but the largest and most overarching law that protects all birds in the United States is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It's a federal law. It protects all birds, eggs, and nests from capturing or killing or destroying. This does apply to all birds. However, game birds, so ducks or waterfowl or upland birds that do have hunting, that's going to have their own specific hunting seasons and regulations. So that's kind of separate. But non-native species that are introduced by humans are not protected under this, and so we'll go over what birds those are. So any lethal control will require or removal of birds or nests, it does require permits. It can be sort of complex to get them, and so that's why we really want to I'm going to go into what are the different management options and strategies that we can take, because this isn't really an option a lot of the time. And so the non-native species that are introduced by humans, they may be able to be controlled in any legal manner if proven to be causing damage, but local regulations do vary. So for example, you can't often use, things that you might use for lethal control of a bird, like a slingshot or a pellet gun. There's regulations against that in specific areas, especially urban areas. So things are going to vary depending on where you are and what kind of landscape you're in. So here are some of our common non-native introduced species in California, and they are also some of our biggest pest species. So we have the rock pigeon. These are feral pigeons that established populations. They were like carrying messages and ended up just people released them, or they ended up just living in the wild. And we still have a lot of them today, and they can vary in color. They can be have varying degrees of white or even be all white. This is the house sparrow. These are the little male house sparrows that I showed earlier, and they are house sparrows, and European starlings are from Europe, and they were introduced by Europeans when they came here because they missed home and they wanted to hear the sounds in nature that they heard at home. And it's an environmental nightmare now, because not only are they pests here, but they also are outcompeting native songbirds and other species that are having a harder time because they are invasive here. Okay, so staying informed. So our next thing is action. So what will we, once we have gone through this, we know what we can do, and what will we do. So we have different tools in our toolkit. So habitat modification, cultural practices, biological control. And we also want to keep in the back of our mind how much effort, time, and money is this gonna take. If you're a business, you might want to consider consumer demand. So I work a lot in wine grape vineyards, and there is a consumer demand for wine grapes or for wine that is farmed more environmentally friendly. So that could drive and limit some of the actions that you might take. Public perception, if you are in more of a public sphere, like controlling Canada geese at a park, just releasing dogs on them, people might see that as cruel. And, even though it was like a sanctioned thing that was going to happen to, get them to get out of the area. And it's with trained dogs and things like that. And it's not necessarily cruel. It can be perceived as that, and there could be backlash. So you always want to keep in mind that, and then especially ecological sustainability. So for cultural practices, this is going to be things you do that remove access to resources, and those resources are always most likely going to be nest sites and food. So you can modify structures in a variety of ways. There's lots of information online about this, depending on what species is causing you trouble and where it's causing you trouble. Exclusion. So there are companies who are experts in applying netting in different situations to, prevent pigeons from nesting over, food processing facilities and, things like that. And then sanitation. Yes, so if you do exclude them, you may have sanitation because you may have less, bird feces and droppings. But what I mean by sanitation here is, sanitation of the area of what, you can control in terms of what food or garbage or trash or things that that birds have access to that is attracting them there. So you want to clean up things or food that might be attracting them. Frightening. So we have auditory frightening devices. So devices that play bird distress calls, and in farmland, things like air cannons and things like that are used. They're not necessarily appropriate for all environments because they can cause, your neighbors would probably complain if you're playing bird distress calls constantly, but used here and there could be effective. Reflective streamers is one tool, this should be under visual. Okay. And then fake predators. So we've all seen rooftops that have these owl statues and effigies, which are for some species, seeing a dead representative. So for crows and also turkey vultures, this can be really effective. If they group up and they see that a dead representative of their species, that it can really, really impact them, and they sense that area as not safe, and it can contribute to some of the reasons that cause them to leave. Removal, trapping, repellents. So I'm not going to cover those things because they're not typically effective at the homeowner scale. For trapping and removal, often this would be a lot of individuals, and if you are on a smaller scale, it's not possible. Even if you're on a larger scale, it's often not cost effective or possible. There are some repellents registered for birds, but they're not typically effective in all situations, and especially if you're thinking on kind of like the backyard scale. If you are using something like that in your yard, there's still going to be things in your neighbor's yards that are going to attract those birds to the area, and just having, a repellent in your yard isn't going to necessarily be effective. So going back to this picture over here on the right, you see that I was talking about the owl statue, and there's a pigeon on its head. So birds are incredibly smart. Some birds are smarter than others, but they can become habituated to these things very, very easily. And so often multiple strategies are going to be needed, and they're going to need to be rotated in a way that it's new, it's novel to them, and those things can help with deterring birds because, it keeps them on their toes a little bit more. Exclusion can actually be very, very effective. It's one of our most effective deterrent tactics, but it's not always practical. It depends on the situation and the scale, but this can be a good option on the small scale. And then including a cost-benefit analysis if possible. So if you're going through all of this money and time, and you're not receiving a large benefit for it, you might want to consider doing something different, or even if it's just a small amount of damage, is tolerating that damage. And then lastly, for evaluation, I really like to stress this point. It's incredibly important to kind of keep a record of what worked, what didn't work for your specific problem. And if it's a neighborhood-wide problem, it's something that you can communicate to your neighbors, and you can start to, affect change in your area through this, through communicating, what you did. So I think that's a really important part of this. I want to provide an example for cliff swallows. So cliff swallows are a native bird species here, and they can be identified by what they look like. Here they have this little, we call it a little headlamp patch, because we have other native swallows as well. But cliff swallows are unique because they nest in colonies, so large numbers. We have barn swallows, they're the ones with the forked tail, and they might nest in similar nests to this, but they won't be in as large numbers, so it doesn't usually become as much of a problem as cliff swallows. But they use these kind of these surfaces to attach these mud nests to, and it's like under eaves or bridges, and they so this shape of the nest can also identify the species. And they have these really strong homing tendencies. So once they initiate these colonies, they and their young are going to come back year after year after year and use this area for nesting. So I think they're an incredibly interesting species, but we do want to, it is good to understand effective management for them, because we can do some things that are, non-invasive and can it can be beneficial for us, and then direct them into nesting to areas that don't harm us as much. So this in the middle is their range map, and the orange color here are areas where cliff swallows breed. Oops, sorry about that. Yellow are areas where cliff swallows may migrate through in the fall and spring to and from breeding and wintering grounds. And so the blue area is where they spend our winter. Obviously, they're not experiencing winter down here because they cross the equator, but they fly these incredibly long distances, and they find their way right back to, your house and your eaves every year. And so if it is a problem, it's something that if you understood the species biology and the regulations, then you could design and do something to prevent that. So the first step would be they do have this, they have a defined legal breeding season by California Fish and Wildlife. So outside of that breeding season, during September 1st to February 15th, you can remove these nests. So old nests that are left behind, they might just start refurbishing them. And so they keep the area seeming attractive to them, because, if you're going these long distances, it's going to be really beneficial if you already have a half-built nest and you're trying to get going right away. And so that can really also attract them back to the area. But yeah, so removing those nests and blocking it off with netting or modifying the surface before the next breeding season can be effective for these guys. But once they arrive and they start building their nests, and once it's past February 15th, there's nothing you can really do. It's really, really rare for the wildlife, California Department of Fish and Wildlife to allow depredation permits after February 15th, because this is one of those things that you kind of have to be vigilant and know. Birds are just very complex and very diverse. So I just wanted to kind of share one example of kind of going through the different steps for these guys. And then I want to touch a little bit on managing pest birds in gardens. So a variety of birds feed on food grown in gardens, and in terms of managing that, exclusion, like I said, is going to be really, really effective because it provides this physical barrier between the birds and the crops. But if you use exclusion at the right times, you might still be able to promote beneficial birds. So for example, keeping your exclusion, keeping it kind of temporary or easy to bring on and off, you can keep them accessible. So obviously maybe not vegetable crops, but I'm thinking of fruit crops, like strawberries or tomatoes. Having birds in and around those plants early on might be beneficial because they can eat the little caterpillars that are eating your plants. But having them excluded once that fruit starts ripening is going to protect that crop. And then I have to also think about other wildlife while giving this talk. But so I want to bring up that some netting is more dangerous for entanglement for things like snakes. So if you can, material like this is going to be the safest. But if you do use netting, you want to make sure you store it properly. So if you're wrapping it up and storing it in your shed, make sure it's, sealed in a plastic bag and not on the ground where other things can come into contact with it. There are a variety of really good web resources on a variety of pest birds. So on the UCIPM pest notes page, which link is here, and the vertebrate pest control handbook link here. So, and if you see anything on there that's not covered, you can always feel free to reach out to me or your UC advisors, and we can provide you additional information. All right, so next I want to talk about promoting beneficial birds. And especially in wine grape vineyards, where I was saying I do a lot of my work, Western bluebirds are really the poster child for that, because they eat an incredible amount of insects and can be attracted to nest in high densities with songbird nest boxes. Also is true, and I'll talk about a little bit, barn owls are also incredibly beneficial by providing vertebrate pest control. So they eat lots of rodents, and they can also be attracted with nest boxes. So do songbirds actually help with insect pests? And there's been a lot of research on this in agricultural systems. And some of the really exciting findings are pointing us in the direction of saying, yes, they are beneficial. So there may be drawbacks, but when you include the pros and the cons in your analysis, there's a overwhelming number of studies showing the beneficial nature of birds. So for research on songbirds and their diet, the way that researchers look at this is they take poop samples and they take them back to the lab, and they use these forensic DNA techniques. They can find out what the birds were eating by the bugs' DNA that's left over in their feces. So it's a really exciting method that's becoming more and more accessible to researchers. So there's more studies utilizing this technique, and we can look at what birds are eating on a large scale. And we can't use our binoculars and look at every single bug that birds are eating. So this gives us kind of a way to, like I said, do that on a larger scale. And so just a couple highlights. So some of these studies have showed that birds eat, or songbirds have a varied diet, and they consume prey species that are abundant. So that's really promising, because that means that they're not going to just specialize on a single insect. They're going to, if something becomes very abundant, it's probably becoming a pest, and birds can respond to that, and they can help reduce those pest numbers. They looked at bluebird diet specifically in California vineyards, and their diet was 50% herbivorous insects, so those insects that were eating crops. But they're also eating things that provide other benefits to us, like eating mosquitoes. That can help reduce the mosquito population and the diseases transmitted by mosquitoes. So super beneficial. And then we also did a study where we excluded birds from some area of the crops, and we looked at how much more insect damage was in those areas where birds were excluded. It was so they were reducing, in areas that weren't excluded, birds weren't excluded, they were reducing the abundance of insects. And we also found a lot more damage in areas where birds were excluded. So how can you do this kind of on the homeowner level? And One thing you could do is you could promote and grow complex landscapes. So these are more likely to promote beneficial birds and deter pest birds because it's going to provide the food and shelter and resources that beneficial birds need. And so especially thinking about native plants, because those are the things that birds have evolved and lived here with for most, of their time here on Earth. And these non-native plantings and landscapes in our urban areas, they can be more attractive to non-native pest birds. Especially like lawns and things like that. So like large monocultures, they do provide, if there is, so like for pests, monocultures provide an ample resource for whatever is a pest on that monoculture. And it doesn't provide enough resources to support other species that might keep those pests in check. So, and also monocultures are managed with chemical inputs, and that has other negative impacts on and effects on organisms and food webs and things like that. So diverse, complex landscapes are good. The way we think about that in farmlands is we have these large monocultures of crops, but using these woody field margins or, preserving, restoring, and planting new areas with habitat that we can attract those beneficial birds that are consuming those pest insects. So web resources on bird-friendly landscapes, I highly recommend you check out the California Native Plant Society website, and they have information on, you can, if you make a login, you can do these advanced searches and you can really type in, you can have so many criteria and you can really find out the best plants for your area based on, whatever criteria you have and specific for your location and climate. If you just want to, on a smaller scale, grow some containers on your balcony or anything like that, they have ideas here. They have more information about like habitat for birds and insects and supporting biodiversity. One really big hurdle for this in a lot of neighborhoods is the homeowners association guidelines. So if you do have that, that there's guidelines against native plant yards, you could get involved in changing those guidelines or, encouraging plantings to be native and information on making it look nice, which is always good in urban landscapes. The Audubon Society has lots of information about birds and native plants and how to track them. So I recommend using these resources and reaching out to us if you have more questions. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about songbird nest boxes. So I have just some of the species that use songbird nest boxes here in California. So we have our ash-throated flycatcher, western bluebird, tree swallows, and house wrens. And by putting songbird nest boxes in certain areas, we're attracting birds to nest there. And when they have an active nest, they have lots of hungry mouths to feed. And so that just increases the amount of insect pest control that they're providing. So if you do want to install a songbird nest box, this is something that can be done, any time of the year, but by late summer or fall, if you want to try to get a bird nesting in that by the next breeding season in spring. Especially bluebirds, they really like grasslands and open areas or riparian area edges, but other things like the ash-throated flycatchers and the house wrens, they'll nest in riparian areas, farmland, parks, natural areas, but backyards can be a really good place for songbird nest boxes. Typically, they're going to be more successful in areas that have some proximity to natural areas or parks. But if you do have or know of a bird that uses a nest box or is a cavity nester that's in your neighborhood, then they could potentially use these nest boxes, even if you're not in proximity to a natural area. So avoiding things that could disturb the nest boxes. So mostly it's people. You want to minimize people, being constantly near it. So if you're putting this in your backyard and you have like an outdoor patio area, try to put it, away from that in an area of the yard that's, not visited frequently. And outdoor cats can be a really big problem. So don't put them in areas with outdoor cats, or areas with dogs. You can, but you have to be pretty, if you know that your nest box is active and the babies are coming out and you can separate that area from where your dogs are, that can be okay. But when the babies leave the nest box, they are very, very clumsy and spend a day or two kind of hopping around on the ground. They'll still get fed by their parents and stuff, but they can be really vulnerable. There are good nest box designs, and there's some information about predator guards and designs on, and the sizes of different things with what the construction should be to attract specific species, on this website, nestwatch.org. This is going to be a really good resource because it can tell you, based on where you are, what birds might be there, what habitats they use, and when they would be nesting and how long. And see, this is a really cool resource that I recommend you check out if you're interested in that. Just on the note of creating safer environment for birds and keeping them around. So cats kill billions of birds a year, but also window collisions kill billions of birds as well. And a lot of these are happening not necessarily on skyscrapers, which we might think, but at about 40 to 50% do happen on the kind of individual home level. And so there are resources to that you can do that you can check out to learn how to prevent bird window collisions, and American Bird Conservancy. So there's lots of information there, and yeah, it's something that anyone can do to make an impact on bird populations. Let me check on my time. Okay, so my last little segment here is on pest control from raptors, and we have just a few of our likely culprits are in California. So we have American kestrel, barn owl, and red-tailed hawk. But we are really lucky here in California. We have an incredibly abundant and diverse raptor population. We even have, in cities that are a little bit older, we have urban raptors nesting. Some cities have urban barn owl programs, and that can be really, really great in terms of natural pest control in these landscapes. Sorry. Yeah, so we can attract them to our landscapes, certain landscapes, with things like nest boxes, large trees, and raptor perches, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those. But first, I want to point out that if we do have or are attracting or supporting a raptor population in a particular area, the benefits that you receive are not only limited to the number of animals that those raptors can eat. They are going to be eating pests, but they're also going to be scaring them. So that can change pests' behavior, and that can cause them to be scared more of the time. And they're scared and they're stressed. And that means that they're spending less time eating, and they're spending less time doing their pest activity. And so just kind of creating this natural balanced ecosystem, you can also reduce the unwanted effects of pests. So some raptor species and their diet on the right. And what I really want to point out here is that most raptors do eat small rodents, which are often pests. So gophers, voles, mice, and rats. And that can be really beneficial in terms of vertebrate pest control. So this is, yeah, I don't think that will play. So this is kind of so this slide here, I just wanted to highlight. So there's been a lot of research on how many rodents are barn owls actually eating. And it was quantified by the Matt Johnson's lab in Humboldt. They work in Napa vineyards, and they studied how many rodents barn owls were removing. And they said that a single nest removed upwards of 3,400 rodents in a single year. And so barn owls are really scaring those prey, but they're also really eating a lot of them as well. So barn owls are really, really unique because they have an incredibly long breeding season. So if you do attract them and they are nesting, they're going to be there for quite a while. They can start in California as early as January, sometimes even earlier. They have to incubate their eggs for 4 weeks, and they take 1 month of incubating the eggs, and then it takes the nestlings, once they hatch, 2 months to reach kind of their full adult size and feathers, and then they're still dependent on the parents for another couple weeks after that. But experienced pairs, once they go through this, they may also nest again. So I really like to stress this, because if you are going to put up a barn owl box, then you really need to make sure you're putting up a safe barn owl box. They have to be really, really sturdy. They have to have these kind of anti-predator defense things. So oftentimes having it on a pole prevents mammalian predators. Having an appropriately sized opening can exclude larger predators. Especially if you live in the Central Valley or in areas where it gets really hot, you want to make sure that if it isn't shaded by a tree or a house or structure in the afternoon, you want to make sure you have these panels for shade to prevent the nest boxes from overheating. And if you want to build nest boxes, there's some plans here, and there's lots of information at the Napa Wildlife Rescue. They also sell nest boxes, really good ones. So this isn't going to be necessarily great for, really dense urban areas, unless you already have a barn owl population established and know about it in your area. So I live in Davis here, we do have an urban barn owl population. And so they've worked to kind of expand that over the city footprint by, continuing to add boxes. So even though it is urban, there are barn owls, but if you have an urban area and you don't really have barn owls nearby, it might take a long time to attract a barn owl to your nest box. So it's really context dependent. The more proximity you have to natural habitat or open habitat, so grasslands, oak savannas, parks, even fields, schools, campuses, things like that, that's going to increase your chances of attracting a barn owl. Barn owls don't nest inside of dense forests. We want to make sure that we are protecting them by not putting their nest boxes near busy roads, especially roads where there's fast speed limits. And I say houses because sometimes they can be really loud at night. And so sometimes people can complain if they get a really noisy nest. It just depends. Some people actually enjoy it, but I do put that as a caveat on here. Cleaning your nest boxes and maintaining them is incredibly important and essential. If you put up a nest box, you are responsible for it, and you need to make sure that it stays safe for animals that are going to be using it. So for songbirds, that means that you're going to, at the end of the season, so in early fall, you can clean it out completely and leave it empty. And also there's if you did have a nest in there, different species use different nesting materials. So you can see, if you didn't know already, you can see what type of species nested in there by what the nest looked like. For barn owl nest boxes, we just want to make sure that that pellet debris, so they're eating their prey whole, and then they're coughing up pellets of bones and fur. And so those things build up over that 3-month period of time and effectively shrinking the size of the nest box that's available to them. So we have to make sure that that doesn't build up too much and create like a really small area for them. So sweeping out some of those pellet debris, you can leave some of that, or you can also put some wood chips is important because they don't make a nest. They don't bring anything in other than regurgitating pellets. And that's if the nest box is completely empty, if they lay eggs on it, they can roll around and they need to keep their eggs together so that they can incubate them. And if they have them rolling all over the place, then it could cause 1 or 2 of the eggs not to hatch. So just keep in mind these little tips and tricks that can help make them the most successful. So the last 2 things that I want to talk about are planting and preserving large trees. And if you don't have large trees, you could consider using installing some raptor perches. But large trees, most raptors that don't use nest boxes would use large trees to nest in. And and so you can find a lot of these species nesting in urban areas. So great horned owls, red-shouldered hawks, Cooper's hawks. In Davis, we have urban nesting Swainson's hawks, which is really phenomenal. But you could think about what trees are good for your area. And this talk isn't long enough for me to cover that. So asking an expert or thinking about what works in your area is really important before you plant it. And also just noting that depending on where you are, different habitats are going to attract different species. So using that Nest Watch site, there's I think it's by the same group. So Cornell, they have Nest Watch, but they also have All About Birds. I think I may have a link to that at the end, but they have information on all bird species, and they can talk about, you can learn about the different habitats that different birds are attracted to. If you are in an open area, so, a school or a campus, or if you're on the edge of an open area, you don't have trees yet, you could use raptor perches. And raptors love hunting from elevated perches or just kind of resting and looking around. And you can make them out of a variety of things, but they work best, in open areas at the highest point of the landscape, so they get the best view. And sometimes people, farmers or land managers, they can use these in areas where there are things like ground squirrels. And barn owls don't really target ground squirrels very much, but diurnal raptors will target ground squirrels. So that's something to keep in mind. And so like I said, they can be made out of a variety of things, but the main recommendations here are that you have a wooden crossbeam and that it's about 15 feet high. So some studies have shown that, that it's not necessary to make your perch 20 feet high, but, a 10-foot high perch might not be used as often. So thinking about stuff like that is important if you're considering putting out raptor perches, because you want to make it so that you're as successful as you can be. So with that, that's the end of the content that I have today, but I believe we have time for questions. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Breanna, for a great presentation.